Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Paulina Martyniak and I am part of UCD College of Business Alumni Relations team. I am delighted to welcome you all to the first UCD College of Business student event organized by Alumni Relations team in this academic year. The event is entitled The Role of Business in the New Sustainable World. The event format is 30 minutes panel discussion, which will be moderated by the UCD College of Business Associate Professor in Consumer Behavior and Technology Adoption, Hertie Schaltema. And we will be hearing from two business alumni speakers who are experts in the field of sustainability. Afterwards, we will have 10 minutes for your questions, so be sure to drop any of your questions you have into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. The speakers will answer as many questions as they can, and we aim to wrap up at 1:45 p.m. today. Finally, the session will be recorded, so if you want to revisit it or if you have any connectivity troubles today, the link to the video will be shared with you afterwards. So that's all from me, and over to you, Hertie.
Thank you very much, Paulina. Thank you so much for having me and asking me to chair this session. So 2 weeks ago, the headline of the United Nations News said, "Business leaders join UN chief to step up action for sustainability." And the Secretary of the UN Action, Antonio Guterres, said that business goals were very clear: to build a sustainable, net zero, resilient and equitable world, to better align investments with sustainable development and act on their commitments with credible timelines, targets and plans. Now, as we speak, and I'm sure everybody is aware of this, the COP26 is currently happening in Glasgow. And therefore, I think this is a very timely moment to discuss the responsibility of industry when it comes to sustainability. What is industry's role? What can businesses do? And where does their responsibility end? How might government support sustainable business models? And in addition, what does the future look like? And how can business schools help to develop business leaders for a more sustainable model? And therefore, I'm delighted to introduce today two panelists. First of all, there's Aoife Connaughton, who's from Deloitte. She's a leader in Deloitte's fast-growing sustainability practice in Ireland. She has over 10 years of experience leading high-impact sustainable programs, driving sustainable growth and introducing new business practices and technologies to organizations. As a sustainability strategy and climate risk lead in Ireland and bring deep expertise in sustainable engagement, partnering and sustainable supply chains and the use of technology to support sustainable programs. The second panelist is Jane Duncan, who is an alumni and has a BA in Economics and French and an MSc from Smurfit Business School. Jane is currently the Director of Operations at the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative platform, which is an organization consisting of over 150 members in the food and drink industry, from fast-moving consumer goods to small citrus producers in Italy, all with the common objective of producing and procuring agriculture produce in a more sustainable way. Jane has worked with the SAI platform for the last 6 years and is responsible for all overall management and strategic directions of the organizations. I'm very delighted to welcome you both to this panel session. And what I'm planning to do is have a very open and relaxed conversation around topics of sustainable business. So from the many economic activities of business, the main cause of climate change and environmental degradation is very often attributed to industry and businesses. But the question I would first pose to you is, how do you see the moral responsibility of businesses in addressing environmental issues and climate change? Can I ask Jane to respond to this first, please?
Certainly. Thank you, Gertie, and good afternoon, everybody. And just responding to your question about business and its responsibility, I think, we're at a moment in history that is really unprecedented, and climate action is no longer confined to the direction given by policymakers. It's a social movement driven by both economic and ethical imperatives and supported by growing amounts of data. You know, and now we're at a point when it really is essential to stop the worst effects of climate change and create a sustainable global economy. And everyone has a role to play in this, from the government down to the individuals. So it's one thing that I feel quite strongly about, is that there is joint responsibility here. It can't just be fall down to one industry sector or one sector of society to address it. In terms of businesses, certainly from where I'm sitting, I work with a lot of, you know, big global companies, the likes of Nestle, Unilever, and so on. And, you know, those companies have been addressing sustainability for quite a long time. In fact, it was Unilever, Danone, and Nestle who set up Sci Platform nearly 20 years ago. And the reason they did was because they felt, look, we have skirted around the edges of CSR, corporate social responsibility, but there's something much bigger looming, and that is the impact on their businesses from climate change. And they felt that these issues were far too big to address single-handedly, and they had to come together as an industry to collaborate and come up with sort of joint actions and solutions to some of those challenges, but also recognizing that there are other stakeholders involved as well who need to be involved, you know, who need to be part of that. So it could be governments, it could be civil society, or it could be consumers. So I certainly see a move towards business stepping up and taking the responsibilities a lot more seriously. And quite honestly, I don't think they're not going to get away with it, in inverted commas. There's so much focus on business now to do the right thing. I mean, I think before it was a case of do less harm, whereas now it's really, you know, do more good. And I think, you know, we're seeing it. I certainly see it in the food and drink industry with the measures that companies are taking. They realize that actually the way we operate our businesses has to change. We have to take this on board, you know, and it's not a case, there will have to be trade-offs. There are no easy solutions, but everybody has to step in and do their bit.
Thanks so much. Aoife, what do you think about the moral responsibility of businesses?
Yeah. So no, I definitely echo a lot of Jane's points. And, you know, before I rejoined Deloitte a few years ago, I was working in a kind of similar space, kind of multi-stakeholder platforms. And I think it is, companies know that they have a moral responsibility, but ultimately we're talking about systems change here. So people have to work together. They have to, and the big actors in the supply chain need to kind of convene all of the other actors in supply chain and use their market power for good. I think something that's really important to bear in mind is the systems change point of it. So sometimes, you know, you hear the kind of narrative about, you know, your personal carbon footprint and what individual actions that we can do. And our individual actions are incredibly important. And every action, you know, every single gram of carbon counts. Like, I think a fact I didn't even fully realize until recently was, like, the world literally won't, for every ton of carbon that's being released now, will last forever. And the world will not stop warming. You know, keep every ton that's released is heating the world more and more. So every action absolutely counts. But when you look at that kind of moral responsibility, I think it comes back to actually organizations need to look at their sphere of influence, look at their theory of change, and actually operate as part of that system. So they need to actively lobby and advocate for change. They need to engage the regulators, engage their consumers, and not look at it passively. Like, a couple of years ago, you know, we had clients kind of saying, you know, oh, you know, we might want to do things, but actually, you know, if the consumer demand isn't there, you know, will our shareholders really let us? You know, there is kind of a genuine difficult situation for businesses where they you know, they have this pecuniary duty to actually make money. Essentially, they have to do what's right for their shareholders, but ultimately, you know, it's on their shoulders, you know, not on their shoulders alone. And a couple of years ago, you know, I think at the last major COP, like, or the Paris COP, the narrative was very much that actually it was businesses going in and pushing for greater challenge and pushing for, you know, trying to push the boat out and actually go for a higher level of ambition. But what we're seeing in the last kind of year or so is actually it's only now that the kind of regulatory agenda has caught up. So, you know, we've released our carbon budgets in the last couple of weeks. there's going to be legally binding requirements for industry. And it's those kind of regulatory forces and policies are the things that are actually bringing all of the businesses online, even the kind of leader businesses that we normally expect to be leading out here. Ultimately, businesses seem to need that kind of that regulatory signposting to give them, you know, the agency, I suppose, to do the change that they know that they're morally obliged to do.
So it's interesting. So you both refer to collective action and everybody taking their responsibility. And there's multiple actors in this. There's industry, there's businesses, there's governments, there's consumers. And if everybody was collectively acting on this, I'd agree, you might create real progress. I think the risk there might be is that everybody would push the responsibility to another actor and say, well, the government needs to provide regulations for businesses to do their share. Consumers will have to take their part. So my question would be, how do we prevent that the responsibility is always pushed to another actor instead of creating this more collective action? Eva.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. Like, I think something that we've seen in the last year, which is really welcome, is actually increased scrutiny from the media and from, you know, different environmental NGOs, particularly where they're actually holding people to account. So on the one hand, you might have organizations saying, oh, we really want to, you know, support a greener economy, but on the other side, they might be spending 95% of their marketing budget on pushing a product that's fundamentally unsustainable, and like that's just not acceptable. I do think it's difficult. Like, I think you need the activists, you need that external scrutiny. You know, disclosures play an important part. So being able to use things like, you know, the Carbon Disclosure Project or other disclosure mechanisms and frameworks, so that actually people are held to actually reach the targets that they've publicly committed to. But I think it's definitely challenging.
Jane, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I think it's something that we come across a lot. It's who's going to carry the cost for it. So looking particularly at the food and drink value chain, there is a feeling that, you know, that the cost gets pushed down the whole time. So, you know, the large manufacturers and processors will say, well, it's what the consumer wants, therefore we need to do it. And there's very much a knee-jerk reaction to what is perceived as what the consumer wants, which I think we have to be very careful about, because often decisions are taken on, you know, without any sort of sound basis, are taken on sort of social media sound bites, which is a very, very dangerous way to decide on a company's strategy or policy. It plays a part, but it shouldn't be the be-all and end-all. So what we would find is that consumers, there's a perception that the consumer wants something, the manufacturer will go to their suppliers and say, we want this, and then the cost of it gets pushed further and further down to the farmer ultimately. And that's actually that is what's causing a bottleneck in achieving sustainability goals, you know, certainly from my perspective, because it reaches a certain point when you cannot push that cost any further without, say, you know, farmers are there, the people they're selling into going out of business. And I think there's finally a realization that is the case, that we need to look at spreading the cost more equitably throughout the value chain. And again, it's, you know, the companies are waking up to this. They're realizing that it's actually our responsibility to do this as well. They're challenged within their own organizations, because often you've had the sustainability teams who sit apart from the procurement teams. So the sustainability guys are saying, look, you need to make sure that you are sourcing, you know, that you're sourcing from X, Y, Z, that the carbon footprint is reduced and so on. And the procurement guys have been told, look, you know, you need to buy at the cheapest possible price. So again, I think it's something that's changing, but it's taking a really long time to get there. Whereas ultimately sustainability needs to be built into sort of the DNA of the actual procurement team, that it's not even something that's questioned, it's just something that you do. So we need to, in terms of passing on the course, companies themselves need to be more mindful of that, and that needs to go right up to CEO level, so that they're conscious that if we're doing this, if we're going out, we're making claims, if we're saying we're adhering to, you know, whatever protocols are out there, we're making these carbon emission commitments, that it actually means something within the company, and it means that we need to, you know, to develop our business model for it, because you can't just fuel switch your way out of climate change. You know, the whole business model needs to shift. So the kind of take, make, dispose policy that has been prevalent for a very long time needs to change to a more circular approach. So we're focusing on recycling, upcycling, reusing, whatever term you want to use, and that is going to take innovation on the part of businesses to make sure that that is happening, and the whole economy becomes more circular.
And interesting opportunities in that as well. You know, like I think the circular economy is probably the area that's most exciting and has most amount of opportunities for businesses in Ireland. And it's an area where there's still, you know, kind of growing awareness and understanding of it. But I think it's an awful lot easier for businesses to engage in things where they feel that there's market opportunity. You know, they're just hardwired in that way to focus on opportunity and growth, unfortunately. And, you know, but you do notice that when people actually start exploring the circular economy and they kind of start going, oh, actually, you know, we could there's lots to win here and a lot to do, but actually the role of the company might need to evolve and their entire operating model might need to change. And, you know, it any which way you look at, you know, how businesses are going to achieve, you know, 7% year-on-year greenhouse gas emissions up to 2030, you're looking at kind of hard, you know, changing the wiring of the business and actually completely transforming them. And I think that penny is starting to drop, but actually it still hasn't fully dropped. People still can't fully understand the scale of change that's needed.
Interesting. So I wanted to go back to something that Jane referred to, which is businesses have all sorts of assumptions about what consumers want. And you're referring to this as well with the circular economy. Consumers don't always fully understand what it means and what they're required to do to support this circular economy. And I was going to refer to a case which happened last year in the Netherlands, where the oil giant Royal Dutch Shell was ordered in a court ruling to reduce their CO2 emissions. And this was a court case that was brought forward by environmental groups and consumers, including citizens. And they really demanded that Shell would change their business models, reduce their CO2 emissions with enormous amounts. And I was going to ask, what do you think of this type of development? What do you think the influence of businesses is if civilians and environmental groups now can go to court and demand change and demand more sustainable business models?
The environmentalist in me is super excited by it, because genuinely, I think it took everyone by surprise. I don't think anyone expected Shell to lose that case. You know, we have a brilliant example here in Ireland. So the Climate Case Ireland case last year, it was the second case in globally ever where a government was found liable for basically Ireland's government's targets weren't ambitious enough. So the case focused around saying actually the mitigation plan that the Irish government had in place wasn't going to meet our Paris commitments, and they needed to up their game. And again, that was a citizen-led grassroots campaign, and they won. And the result of that has been a massively strengthened Climate Act. So I think it's really, really exciting. And again, I think it goes back to like Greta Thunberg yesterday. You know, she's over at COP. She doesn't have an official invite, so it's a bit of a bone of contention. But you know, she was saying, you know, the power is actually in the people like her who are outside the building, who are advocating and lobbying and creating that pressure. And the amount of corporate presentations that I've seen with a photo of Greta somewhere in them going, you know, this is an example of something that's happening, and pressure, and like that's absolutely unheard of, you know, even 5 years ago. Like I think, you know, I think it's really exciting, but it's definitely making businesses sit up. And you know, you know, my view would always have been that businesses would look at a lot of this from a kind of opportunity lens, but we're actually seeing a lot of businesses look at it from kind of a risk perspective, you know, understanding climate risks, actually, you know, addressing, you know, boards going, you know, actually, have we got our risks covered? You know, what about this activism? How do we respond to this consumer pressure? And as far as I'm concerned, keep it coming from every angle. It's welcome, because it does genuinely change how businesses perceive the risk and what they do about it.
And I think it is the only way that businesses will actually change. It's that fear, it's that risk factor. Like years ago when Unilever, who are quite progressive in terms of sustainability and so on, but their whole building was ambushed by I think it was by monkeys or chimpanzees or something, on the roof of the building, and it really created a stir. So it has certainly put the skates under a lot of other companies as well. And, I think this is no longer, I think maybe even 5-6 years ago, it was seen as a nice to have, something that was good to refer to in your annual report, your CSR report, that we're past that stage. This is basically a license to operate, And it, just going back to your question about the Shell case, I think it is good that companies are accountable. And I think certainly the fossil fuel companies are going to be under a lot more pressure. Like, I think it was the CDF report from 2017 that reckoned 100 companies in the world were responsible for 77% of carbon emissions, and they were mainly, fossil fuel companies. So they are definitely under the spotlight. Whether we have cases for all of them, I don't know. I'm a bit hesitant on that, because I think, court cases are very costly. We would be better putting the money, all that time and resource, into actually coming up with better, more innovative ways of doing business. I think 1 or 2 cases to kind of shake the foundations is probably no harm. If there become too many of them, actually, I think it'll shut businesses down. They would be afraid to innovate. The risk of being caught out will just be too high. So we need to make sure that we have the right balance, or else it'll just be, the legal industry who benefit from it all.
So how do we create that right balance then?
It's kind of, I think it might come back to as well, like every actor, I suppose, has a different part to play. It's like, something we say a lot is kind of like every job is going to become a climate job. Before, people kind of thought it was something that people had to have deep specialism in, or be a decarbonization specialist. But a bit like digital jobs, every job's going to have a climate angle. But likewise, every organization has a role to play in actually supporting this transition. If it's civil society, NGOs, governments, policymakers, educational institutions. And I think it's within each organization or within each individual's role, trying to look at actually, well, what's your sphere of influence, and how can I create the most amount of influence here to drive that transition? And, it's definitely not a kind of binary, the power sits here or the power should sit there. It's actually, it needs that pressure coming from every angle, and it needs that innovation and challenge and excitement as well coming from all the different roles. And I think that's why, as students, it's just such an exciting time, because genuinely, there's a thirst for your enthusiasm and for your knowledge, and there's roles out there that haven't been invented yet, and might be invented in the next 3 months, that have your name on them.
Nice. So that actually follows up quite nicely on the role of business schools in this model, because what you're basically arguing is that everybody in every position needs to have some sort of knowledge about sustainability and embed that in their practices, in their culture, in business models. And then the question obviously is, what can business schools do, or how should they change their education in your view to make this happening?
Well, I think people are going to need to be a lot more agile within their, within their jobs. So I think from a business school perspective, agility is one thing, because I don't think anybody can expect to go into a job now and that it's going to be the same format for the next 10 or 15 years. That just doesn't exist anymore. I think also being able to sort of analyze the various trade-offs and come up with solutions on those, because the problem sometimes can be that if you fix one problem, you generate another. And I think that's something that we need to, that we need to be very conscious of. And even within companies themselves, somebody in one area can come up with an idea, but it's actually going to be counterproductive for another part of the company or another part of the environment. So I think that there's quite a lot of analysis needed there, and sort of thinking things through to come up to address the challenges we face in a holistic way. It's not just a case of fix one problem and move on. It's much more complex than that.
Interesting. Aoife?
Again, I think it's the critical thinking skill. So I think something like these issues are evolving so quickly, and even as a practitioner, it's incredibly hard to keep up, especially when you're working across, multiple sectors and things like that. So I think it's about generating kind of the awareness of the issues at a macro level, and then kind of the enthusiasm and the critical thinking to then explore them, because we obviously take in a lot of graduates, and we're sitting there looking at a client, and we're seeing an issue and kind of like, oh, what other angles do we need to explore here? Are we missing a trick? And actually it is, you need to have that thirst and hunger and interest for the area, because it's fascinating. It's such an exciting area to work in. So I think it's about trying to create those sparks and try and create as much awareness of all, the good practices, the bad practices, why it's hard, why it's challenging. And if that spark's ignited, then I think it's very easy for people to follow it. But you need to have that base, because actually you don't know what you don't know. And that's something with this area that people often, as soon as they start getting into it, they go, oh my God, who would have thought palm oil was so awful? And then you stick out, it's not just palm oil, take a seat. So I think it is just trying to get as much of that kind of that broad, particularly maybe at undergrad level, that broad awareness, and then finding the opportunities to specialize later on.
Jane, I thought you might wanted to jump in. I don't know. I was looking at your face.
Yeah, no, I think what Aoife said about being able to just analyze all these critical issues and come up with a more holistic approach, I think is going to be key for it. I think it's definitely, it is an exciting time. It is definitely a time when we're going to see jobs that have, new jobs out there that have not, that would not have, say, featured 4 years ago even. And it just amazes me even to see the number of job titles now that have the word sustainability in them. It's almost to the point that you think the word is becoming overused. It's starting to be meaningless. But no, it's definitely a very interesting, exciting area to work in. And I think there will be plenty of opportunities for a good few years to come.
I absolutely agree. I think sustainability is such a wicked problem with multiple angles, multiple approaches, and so complex that I'd agree that you need a very broad scope to even understand what you don't know or where you might look for more information. So I think we should check the Q&A. I see 2 questions at the moment. I wanted to throw that into the discussion. So Joseph is first asking, I would love to hear thoughts about the direction of future of vertical farming. I would assume that is directed at Jane.
Okay. Well, I think, we're farming is at our agriculture in general is at a major crossroads at the moment. And it is going to take a few years to come up with new innovation and technology. Vertical farming is still a pretty new concept, but I think everything is up for consideration and for development at the moment. I mean, one of the advantages obviously of vertical farming, particularly in, say, in Asia, where you've got very dense populations and so on, is that you're actually, you're bringing food closer to the large centers, where, in urban spreads where it's needed. So, we've all heard about eating local, eating in season, and so on. And I think vertical farming does have a role to play in that. But again, there are also trade-offs as well, because vertical farming is very energy intensive, it is very water intensive. So, more so than probably conventional production. So there are all things that we need to, it's not the panacea to all problems, because you do have to bear in mind the intensity of it as well.
And I suppose that's a key message, isn't it? Like, there isn't a panacea for a lot of this, but there's an awful lot of tools and technologies and innovations out there that are, that probably need investment from businesses to scale them and to explore them, and they might need that kind of the starter funds to actually explore them. But like, there's a great website called Project Drawdown that has a list of all the innovations that are out there that technically would get us to net zero. And it's not saying that any of them are all of none of them are the only solution, but actually we need a massive arsenal, and we need to start experimenting with all these different tools, and finding the right use cases for them.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, Aoife, that you make about experimenting. In what we're looking at is, say, reference farms, where you're trying new things, trying new technologies, trying new methods, and so on. And the idea is that it's done at quite low cost. You go in, you try something. If it doesn't work, don't be afraid to walk away from it. It's an investment, but it's not a huge investment. Move on to the next thing. And I think there is going to be a lot of trial and error in agriculture over the coming years, because there's new innovation, new technology every single day that is being tried out. Some will work, some won't. But actually, if I could just make a point, if I could just on this while we're talking about sustainability and the food industry, one of the key areas that we have to address is food waste, because we talk about sustainability, we talk about increasing populations and so on. But at the moment, 30% of the food that we produce is wasted. That would go a long way to feed the growing population. So there's that angle of it, but there's also the resource waste that goes into producing that food. And if I had to say one, if certainly from the food industry perspective, one of the key issues that we have to tackle is food waste. And I think that's certainly something that we can all play a role in, from the individual consumer to the large multinational. By the large multinational, just kind of go having a business model that's based on selling, encouraging people to overconsume is.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And restaurants in the middle of that, I think, play an important role as well.
Yeah.
So Christopher's asking Aoife the following question. Many investors turn down their investments in fossil fuel companies, even though they are still very profitable. Is Deloitte following this trend? And what did it do in particular to support sustainable businesses rather than non-sustainable ones?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So like the divestment movement, so this idea of kind of divesting funds moving away from fossil companies is really powerful, and taking it's making a lot of strides. So Deloitte, I suppose, as a private entity firm, Deloitte doesn't actually, I suppose, invest in companies per se, but our pensions are invested. So in Ireland and the UK, I don't actually know about it globally. We have moved, or we are in Ireland, we're moving across to what we call ESG funds, so environmental social governance funds. So they'd be funds that wouldn't be related to fossil fuels. And that's something that, again, as individual actions, it's something we often, when people say, what can you actually do? Very practical thing that nearly all of us can do when you're working and have a pension, is actually look at where your personal pension is invested and making sure that it's not invested in fossil fuels. And then in terms of the work that we do, so the sort of business that Deloitte is that our clients are the biggest clients. We don't tend to work with small organizations. We tend to work with kind of the Fortune 500 or the big blue chip companies. And that involves working with kind of the good and the great, but also the organizations that have a long way to go in the transition to sustainable economy. So we do certainly have programs. So in the UK, we've just sponsored the project, what's called Earthshot Prize. So that's about trying to identify, really cool projects, trying to identify key innovations that are going to support the sustainable economy. And we're the implementation partner for that. So we're working with all of the prize winners of that big global prize, and to try and work out actually how they can scale their organizations. But I suppose business as usual for us is working with big corporates and actually supporting them to change. And I would love if all of that change was all about decarbonization and about sustainability stuff. Unfortunately, it isn't, but it's certainly something that we have seen just a massive change in terms of how companies are talking to us about it, how far up the agenda it's coming. You know, when we companies have risk registers, it's now kind of top 5 on risk registers of most companies, and that means they actually have to start doing something about it, which is where, you know, we talk about jobs that didn't exist. My job didn't exist 3 months ago. You know, I've been working in sustainability for a long time, but I've had many different roles within Deloitte, and you know, we see a lot more demand, hopefully, for this sort of work.
So I think there's certainly a responsibility for industries, business, big companies. Some of the questions are more about individual consumers, and they also have a role to play in this. I'll combine 2 of the questions, which basically come down to how can we change individuals' behavior? And you might link that back to food waste, because I think individual consumers play an important role there as well. But also think about lifestyle changes in terms of holidays, transportation choices, food, again, products we buy. So would you have any ideas around how might we change individuals' consumer behavior?
Increasing awareness and education, I think, is the key way to do it. You know, all of the conversation about climate change is so prevalent at the moment. I think certainly over the next 2 weeks, nobody will be able to avoid any news piece in terms of COP. So, you know, if COP does nothing else, if it increases awareness of climate change for, you know, for more people, it's already something positive. And you know, it's absolutely right. People are talking about sustainability, you know, making decisions on what they're learning on social media and so on. But people have to realize that there is an individual responsibility as well, you know, by, you know, how you dispose of buying water, how you dispose of the bottles and so on, just as one example, the amount of coffee cups, disposable coffee cups we use in a day, all of that sort of thing. And it's not only food, it's the number of flights we take. I know that has been restricted in the last 2 years nearly, but we'll probably pick up again. Fashion is one of the, fast fashion is the biggest user of water, more so even than agriculture. So yeah, so it's everybody, you know, it is everybody saying, right, I'm going to do my bit here. How you get that message home, I'm not sure, but hopefully with sort of increased awareness, maybe it's up to governments. It's up to governments to launch campaigns. I know some companies themselves actually, you know, sort of try to convince their consumers to buy goods by saying, look, we've reduced our carbon footprint and so on. They're taking a more environmental angle in their marketing, and I think that will just increase. But you know, it's absolutely right. It's governments and corporations can't do it on their own.
Huge challenge.
And I wouldn't underestimate the power of kind of pester power. Like, organizations genuinely, like, I've seen single tweets change corporate strategies quicker than years and years of PowerPoint decks that people like me sit around writing. And, you know, even at an individual level, like, you know, again, a lot of CEOs tell us like they've been driven to do things because their kids have nagged them about it. You know, their kids have gone to school, their kids' eyes have been opened, and they're nagging them. And likewise, kind of individuals, like, it's your peer groups, it's what your friends are doing. It's, you know, and like, you know, you see how, you like, you know, among, you know, kind of the student generation, how actually people don't want to buy stuff in pennies anymore. We want to buy stuff on Depop, and they want to buy vintage and retro, and that's a peer movement that's actually moving away from needless constant consumption, which is absolutely amazing and really cool. And I think actually genuinely some corporates, like, you know, I do presentations where you tell them and they're like, really? Like they've no idea that actually suddenly people don't want to wear big labels, and that they'd actually rather kind of upcycle something, or, you know, get something that's vintage. So there is a huge amount of power in what kind of each individual can do, and actually how you can inspire change among your friends and your colleagues and your employers. And, you know, even as a big employer, like, it's our junior staff, like our graduates, are driving a lot of change internally as well.
So let me just finish with a very big question that's in the Q&A, and I think we can round it up like this. Do you both believe that we can achieve the very ambitious targets that are being set? How optimistic are you?
I don't know. They're scientifically possible. So, you know, 1.5 degrees is still within reach. I think the pace is challenging. So I think the pace at which businesses change, the pace at which we adopt innovations and move is challenging. But there's really welcome signs. Like, Ireland's become, a global leader in offshore wind in the last 10 years. Like, who would have thought that? There's some, and actually certain things have changed much faster than people ever would have anticipated. So I think with the momentum and the pressure and all the stars aligning, it's certainly possible. And I suppose it's probably important as well not to think about it as a binary thing. It's not about, is it possible or isn't it? It's like absolutely everything needs to drive forward, because it's literally the future of humanity is at stake. So every ounce of carbon counts, every action counts, every role has a role in driving the change, and it's incredibly important.
Yeah. And I think that is the only way we will get there. If you look at the global, the global targets and the time frame in which they have to be achieved, and you look at how you look at our carbon emissions today, you kind of go that it's a big ask, and it definitely is a big ask, but it has to be a step-by-step approach. Everybody just being really conscious. Okay, what can I do today? Whether it's at home, whether it's in work or whatever, that and obviously corporations as well, that will change this, and governments providing direction, because I think normally industry do not go to governments asking for legislation or direction, but this is the time. They've tried to do it on their own, and because it's so challenging, they're actually welcoming government action now, because at least if measures are there and they have to take, they have to implement. They can say, look, it's not us. We're being told to do this. We've no option in it.
Thank you so much. I think it's very good to hear you both at least have some very optimistic tone in what you're saying, even though there's huge challenges ahead and much to do in the future. So thanks very much for, I think, very thought-provoking and inspiring discussion we had. I'd like to hand over to Paulina now, who will round this up. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Gertie.
Thank you very much, everyone. That was such an interesting conversation on the topic that is very important to us all. Thank you to our speakers, Aoife and Jane, and to Gertie for steering the discussion so well. Thank you also to our students who tuned in today. I really appreciate your time. Thank you all, and have a nice afternoon.